Our Old Testament reading this morning is from the 53rd chapter of Isaiah, beginning at verse 3. He was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity. And as one from whom others hid their faces, he was despised, and we held him of no account. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases. Yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. May God add blessing to the reading and to the understanding of this scripture. Please stand as you're able for the gospel reading. For Mark's Gospel, chapter 14, verses 32 through 42. This is Jesus praying in Gethsemane. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took with him Peter and James and John and began to be distressed and agitated. And he said to them, "I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and keep awake." And going a little further, he threw himself on the ground and prayed that, if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. He said, "Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me. Yet not what I want, but what you want." He came and found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, "Simon, are you asleep? Could you not keep awake 1 hour? Keep awake and pray that you may not come into the time of trial. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." And again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And once more he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to say to him. He came a third time and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? Enough, the hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." The words of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
So it starts with a parade. I mean, we're really thankful and grateful here in Kansas City because we know how to throw a parade. You remember with me in 2015, it had been 300 billion years since the Royals had even been good, let alone winning the World Series. Well, they were good the year before they won the World Series. Previous to that, it had been a long, long time, I think 1985. Most of us were alive back then and can remember that. But it was a long time. But do you remember that parade that we threw? It had been so long since we had one that schools closed. Schools closed. Some people had some strong feelings about that. I might have been one of those. People had to park. They ended up having to park on the interstate because there were so many people who went down to line the parade route. And then 3 years later, our beloved Chiefs, with "Oh, give me Mahomes, where the buffalo roams," took us to the Super Bowl, and we fell behind just like you're supposed to, at least in 2018. And we came roaring back, and we won. And there was again a parade in downtown, and again in front of Union Station, crowds gathered to celebrate. And you know what happens in a parade? What happens in a parade is that all these different kind of people who don't know each other love each other. Some of them perhaps aided by some things they're drinking, but we love each other. And we love this team. And we know their names as if we know them. And we all feel like we're winners together because they won, we won. From my understanding, there's a parade going on about 20 miles west of here this afternoon, I think. Okay, there you go. You feel free to take your palm fronds if you'd like and make a witness to your faith, because I know that'll be important to you. Because the KU Jayhawks won the national championship, and we feel like we know them. I mean, the T-Hen guy threw a pass on the football field yesterday. These players can do anything. They can serve chicken strips at Cane's, from what I understand. And we love them. Some of you love them more than some of the rest of us, but Jesus comes into Jerusalem a winner. I want us not to mistake that. He has defeated disabilities. He's defeated those with leprosy. He's defeated the leprosy in them. He's defeated anything that might cause an illness and set people free. He's defeated boundaries that kept people apart, and he's invited everyone into community. He's defeated these separations between men and women, between slave and free, between Jew and Greek. He's defeated so many things. He's defeated the idea that religion can only be for a select few, and instead has said that God breaks through all those separations and invites all of us to love and be loved. He's coming in a winner because he's defeated all those things that might oppress human beings. And he's coming into Jerusalem in this parade to celebrate the God who is the winner over all the powers that be. The Passover celebration that our Jewish friends have every year, that God passed over the Jewish community, and Pharaoh then said that they could go free from 400 years of slavery. Plague, 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 Passover, parting of the Red Sea, and freedom. I want us, friends, not to misunderstand. The power that God has and Jesus has in God is undefeatable. It's nothing but victory and winning. And then they decide to do the thing that is almost completely unimaginable and unreasonable to any of us. In the Passion of Holy Week, Jesus, through the presence of God, chooses loss. Chooses loss on purpose. Friends, that's the question of our faith. That's the question for each one of us who follows this Jesus and believes in the presence of God. Why in the world, when clearly there is all power and all glory so as to defeat all enemies, do they choose loss? That defines our faith, that choice. So Jesus enters Jerusalem in this palm parade, and then he teaches in the temple, and then on that night of Passover, he draws his disciples together, and we will see that and reflect on that again on Maundy Thursday, this Thursday evening at 7. And then he goes from there to what we heard from the gospel reading this morning. He goes to the Garden of Gethsemane. It's not that he and the disciples haven't been there before. We're told that it's often a place that he would go that was a place of solace, a place where there was protection just by the grove of trees alone, a place where there was comfort, and perhaps in the beauty of that place, a way of centering. I'm going to show you 3 video clips this morning. This first one will give us the realistic picture of what perhaps the garden looked like across from the Temple Mount. If we could play that first video clip, please.
After the Passover meal was complete, Jesus and his disciples left the borrowed room and went to Gethsemane. Now, Gethsemane is an olive grove. You can see it right down here. It's by the Kidron Valley on the lower slopes of the Mount of Olives. It's across the Kidron Valley from the Temple Mount, which you can see up there. Gethsemane means olive press in Hebrew, and it indicates that this was a commercial oil operation. Olive oil in the ancient world was a precious commodity, being used for everything from cooking to cleaning to skincare to lamp fuel. In addition to olive presses, Gethsemane was full of olive trees. In In fact, there's still an olive grove preserved here today. The shelter of these trees made it a great place to seek solitude. It appears that Jesus and his disciples would come to a particular spot, a garden area buried within the olive groves. Jesus would take his closest friends here to rest and pray after long days in the temple complex. But this time it was different. Jesus was overwhelmed with anxiety. The Gospel of Matthew says that he told Peter, James, and John, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me." Matthew 26:38.
I want us to get a sense that having at his fingertips all the power he needed, yet he experienced a kind of anxiety. A kind of anxiety maybe we have known at different times in our lives. The anxiety that comes when we hear words that we don't want to hear from a child or from a parent or from a best friend that tells us that maybe there is an end coming sooner than we would hope. And for people of faith, very often our go-to is prayer. That's a good thing. But it's also probably a place. Where do you go when you need solace? When you need to feel at peace, when you need to be surrounded by something that will remind you that everything's going to be okay, even if everything isn't okay. A place where you can let down, where you can, if you need to, break down. See, that's where Jesus went. And he took his disciples, I believe, because he didn't want to be alone in those moments. He both did and didn't. So he takes them with him to give him that kind of sense of community. But then he tells them to stay in a particular place, and he asks them to stay awake. And then he goes further in, and he pleads. I think he pleads with God. He pleads with himself. Why in the world would I do this? Why do I want to give myself to love people who don't want to be loved by me? To offer healing and freedom to those who would rather stay oppressed in their separation and their polarization and their anxiety of how they will look in front of the Roman Empire. Why do I want to give of myself to those who are sure that I am not who I say I am? Why would I do that? Did he plead not only with God, but with himself? Do we not sometimes ask ourselves, why remain a person of integrity? Why do hard things when the world doesn't realize that doing hard things, the world doesn't seem to care? It says that Jesus is different in these moments than he's ever been. If we could please play that second video clip.
Never before had Jesus' closest disciples heard such language from their teacher, and never before had they seen Jesus in such anguish. The scripture even goes on to tell us that Jesus sweated drops of blood. Now today, the medical community calls this very rare condition hematidrosis, or blood sweat, where the blood oozes from the forehead or the tear ducts, the nose or the nails. It can be caused by severe distress, and obviously, Jesus was in severe distress.
See, while I don't want us to mistake that Jesus came into town as a winner, that God was being celebrated as a winner, I also don't want us to mistake that because of their divine nature, Jesus didn't experience the human agony of disappointment. Disappointment in these disciples. 3 different times Jesus comes out of prayer and finds them sleeping. And he goes back in. Understand, he goes back in 3 times because that's how anguished he is. Friends, when we think we have a God who doesn't perhaps understand, when we're facing our own death, We all will, we all do, actually, each day. We just don't think about it. And I myself have said this, and I've heard other people say this. I'm not afraid of death. I'm at peace with going with God. It's the whole process that I'm not real excited about. Do you think Jesus, knowing the kind of death he was going to die, was not filled with anxiety and stress of how he would get through it, of why he was doing it, of what God could be thinking? And then let me help us understand this. God is facing the death of God's self and God's child, all wrapped into one. So if we're afraid that God doesn't identify with us when we face perhaps the worst thing that we can ever imagine happening in our lives, the death of a child, God knows. God knows. God knows. The Jesus we follow knows what it is to face into that deepest, darkest place and to come to a decision whether or not to trust God. If we could play that final clip, please.
Jesus fully understood everything that was about to transpire. And his prayer, nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done, was such an important moment in time. Some have said that that was the point that the entire battle was won. The final point of resolve to see his mission through to the end. No turning back.
That rings true for me. I don't know for you. That when in that moment in that garden, Jesus says, not my will, but yours be done, that was when Jesus won. That was when death was conquered. That was when love was going to have the last word, not only in that moment, but in every moment since. That love would win every battle. Finally, love will win. And again, Holy Week, friends, is about the very basic essence of our faith. Why would this God of all power and all might and all glory choose for the likes of us, who love imperfectly, who live imperfectly, who disappoint one another over and over and over again, and who disappoint God probably more times than that? Why would God decide that love would win? Because it is the definition of grace. It is a free gift, friends. If it finally would have been about whether we were ever going to live up to what God and Jesus wanted us to, Jesus would have walked out of that garden and away. But he defeated the meritocracy. He defeated the deserving nature that our world is built upon. He defeated it with grace itself that said love wins no matter what the world decides. And the question is, do we live in that great good news? Do we trust and have faith in the God who loves and loves and loves again? Mark Davis says, if you put the synoptic and John's gospel together and you translate the words of how Jesus felt in that garden, that three words keep coming up. One is astounded, another is devastated, and a third is anguished. Jesus was yet astounded that we had not understood his message. Astounded that we were willing to reject the kind of love that he was offering. Friends, when are you astounded in that way? I will tell you, I'm astounded that there is a man who's now being questioned for advertising and putting out on his whatever, social media, that the mass murder at Sandy Hook of those kindergartners and first graders didn't happen, that it was fake. I'm astounded. I'm astounded at our inhumanity to one another. I'm astounded at our unwillingness, if we think someone is on the opposite political side as we are, that we're going to create increased anxiety and pain for families who are already living that pain. I'm astounded too, Jesus. See, that's what he was fighting. That astonishment that human beings didn't want certain people to be loved because they didn't fit, because they were Samaritan women at wells, because they were hemorrhaging women along a parade route, because they were 10 lepers who were in a leper colony crying out for help, because they were a man with a withered hand who came to the Sabbath to be healed. And Jesus healed all of them, and he had to be astounded that people as a whole were not happy about that. And filled with anguish. Mark Davis says, one of the words is translated anguish. The anguish that comes when we know we can't change an outcome. The anguish that comes when we know that being ourselves is not going to be received by the world because faith does not seem to hold a lot of water anymore. The anguish that comes knowing that what he was going to walk into was going to cause pain, unbearable pain, and devastation, finally. Devastated that he was going to leave his friends, and he wasn't sure what would happen to them. But he knew that they would go through the time of trial. Peter says to Jesus, as they're at the table, and Jesus is getting ready to go to the Garden of Gethsemane, and he says, all of you are going to abandon me. And Peter says, well, everybody might, but I won't. And Jesus says, actually, Peter, not only will you, but you will deny knowing me 3 times. The devastation of being disappointed in those he'd spent the most time with. Friends, Jesus goes into the Garden of Gethsemane with all of that, and let me come to a close with a quote that I just couldn't get out of my heart this week. It's by a man named Rob McCoy. So Jesus sat there in Gethsemane and he prayed. He prayed for another way out. He prayed in anguish. He prayed as a man who could feel pain, who would be hurt by betrayal, who would be scarred by the scourge, and would bleed when nails were driven in his arms and legs. He prayed as a man who knew that if he would follow God's will, he would be charged, convicted, mocked, humiliated, abandoned, and nailed to a cross. Knowing all of this full well, he prayed, not my will, but yours be done. Then he rose and stood up for all that he had lived for. So our question this week, will we rise and stand for all Jesus lived for? Will we allow ourselves to know fully all that Jesus lived for? And hear this, what Jesus lived for was love of God and love of neighbor over and over and over again. So this is the promise, friends. This is the promise. If you will allow God to give you the courage to live your faith, God will resource you and be with you again and again and again in moments when you're aware of God's presence and in moments when you think you don't feel God anywhere near. God will not abandon you. Jesus defeated the final fear any of us need, for death itself. And he stood from that place of courage and lived for us eternally. Amen.